Good afternoon and welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar, From Brownfield to Brightfield, the Impact of Brownfield Redevelopment on Communities. My name is Brian Hepner, Communications Associate with the Illinois Power Agency, and I'm filling in today for our usual Power Hour host, Megha Hamal. A few housekeeping items before we get started. To eliminate background noise, all participants should be muted upon entry. We will be taking questions from our audience for a brief Q&A session toward the end, so please feel free to submit questions at any time. You can do this through the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the IPA website under About Us/events. A couple of points I want to emphasize. This webinar is for general education purposes only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the Illinois Power Agency or its staff. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers for this session. Our first speaker is Greg Dunn. Greg is the Deputy Chief for the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency's Bureau of Land. He began his career over 35 years ago working with the IEPA's drill rig and geoprobe, investigating contaminated sites for potential listing on the national priorities list. Since then, he's served as both unit manager and project manager at the agency, overseeing remedial project management and leaking underground storage tank sections. As deputy chief, Greg oversees those sections as well as several others. Greg joins Power Hour today to provide an overview of brownfield sites and the community benefits and challenges associated with brownfield cleanup and redevelopment. Our next speakers will be Val Story and Brian Ross of the Great Plains Institute. Val Story is Senior Program Manager on the Institute's Renewable Energy team, with over 20 years experience in national clean energy policy and natural resource management. For over a decade, she worked as a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, where she developed and managed its building electrification project and led its offshore wind policy work. Brian Ross is a vice president at the Great Plains Institute, leading its renewable energy market transformation efforts in the Midwest and nationally. He joined the Institute after 20 years as a consultant working with local, regional, and state governments on climate energy planning, policy, and regulation. Brian is helping lead national research efforts on integrating renewable energy development with natural systems. Val and Brian have recently partnered with the Midwest office and state chapter of the Nature Conservancy. During this presentation, they'll discuss community benefits and preservation of natural resources and fostering renewable development on brownfields, as well as opportunities for long-term economic investment. Our final speaker will be Anthony Starr. As Senior Advisor and Interim Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief of the Illinois Power Agency, Anthony oversees the development and preparation of the agency's plans, including the long-term renewable resources procurement plan and the electricity procurement plan. Prior to his role as bureau chief, Anthony was the director of the agency for over 9 years. Before joining the IPA, he served in a variety of roles in energy policy and environmental sustainability. In today's presentation, Anthony will discuss the ways in which brownfields fit into the state's renewable portfolio standard, as well as various targets, challenges, and impacts of brownfield projects. Just an overview of the IPA Power Hour. This is a series of educational and informative webinars on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Some information for the upcoming June webinar. Here, after the conclusion of this presentation, you can visit the IPA website's events page, which will include a registration link for upcoming Power Hour webinars. This slide just provides an overview of the agency and its responsibilities. The Illinois Power Agency, created in 2007, is responsible for the development and implementation of procurement plans for the electricity supply of utility customers, as well as solar incentive programs and the implementation of the renewable portfolio standard. That concludes my introduction. Now I'd like you to join me in welcoming Greg Dunn of the IEPA to start things off. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. Next slide, please. I've spent almost 30 years in working in brownfield sites. And what is a brownfield site? Next slides, please. So there are two definitions, one from US EPA and one from the Illinois EPA. These are the actual definitions that they have provided, and I'm not sure why ours is a little bit different from US EPA's, but the way I see it is any property that's underutilized, whether it be vacant, vacant property, vacant building, is considered a brownfield if there is a potential for contamination existing from previous activities at the site. That would be considered a brownfield site to me. And it can be any kind of, it can be a vacant lot that used to have a house. It could be lead paint there. So it could be anything out there. And as far as US EPA is concerned, they consider there's over 450,000 brownfield sites in the United States. So that's quite a bit. And if you just drive around your municipalities, your towns, your villages, you probably have seen many of these. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of a brownfield cleanup and redevelopment? There are very obvious ones. The obvious is you take a piece of property and you turn it into something better. So you take that vacant building, that vacant piece of property, and make something new out of it. The other thing is, as a kid, I always loved to play around in old buildings. So you reduce those hazards to anybody that could be going into those pieces, into those buildings, whether it be kids, whether it be adults looking to cause trouble, I guess. But it's a way to reduce the contamination at that property. And one thing we have noticed is that once you start redevelopment on these properties, it seems to spur additional development in the area. So that's a big key for these areas. Municipalities like it because it turns those properties back into the tax rolls. You bring taxes back into the communities, you're able to do more with that money coming in. And I think one of the big things I like is that you take these pieces of property, there's already infrastructure there. There's already water lines, there's already sewer lines. You take the infrastructure and able to build something new with the infrastructure that's already in place, instead of going out into the green fields, the cornfields, the pastures, that you're going to have to bring that infrastructure in. You're going to have to bring in the water lines and sewer lines. So you already have that there. And I think one of the bigger things too is you're able to provide jobs to the neighborhood. Whatever you bring in, we believe that you're going to be able to provide jobs to that neighborhood. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges? There are many challenges. One of the things is banks do not like to loan any money to any property that is contaminated or that could potentially be contaminated. And so they're looking for a no further remediation letter from the Illinois EPA. You receive a no further remediation letter through the site remediation program or a voluntary program here at the agency. So a lot of lending institutions will look for that letter before they will lend money. And it's the perception that property could have environmental contamination. So we don't want to touch it. We don't want to even look at it. So that's the stigma with that piece of property. Sometimes there's community support. They don't want the development. Or the development that's going in is not what they want to see. They want to see something else. And so you have to convince the local community of that this is a good project and see the benefits down in the long run. Sometimes we've seen that there is political support or non-support for a project. Again, it goes back to the community. Sometimes the politicians would like to see something different than what is proposed for that piece of property. So there's a lot of discussions behind the scenes on a lot of these projects. And then I think the biggest thing is the size of the property. Certain developers are looking for a certain size. You may have a half acre or less piece of property, and a developer is looking for 2 acres or more. So that can be an issue as you go forward as a challenge. Next slide, please. So what do we have to offer at the Illinois EPA? Well, we can offer some financial assistance and also technical assistance. Next slide, please. What we can do on the technical side, we receive money every year from US EPA to complete 5 to 8 targeted brownfield assessments in the state of Illinois. We typically work with municipalities and not-for-profits to go out and do these targeted brownfield assessments. With that, we've completed over 140 assessments in the 20+ years at 65 communities. We can do phase 1, we can do phase 2s, which are the investigations, or we can do some other. And the other is we can provide some money for remediation at these sites. So once we go out and complete a phase 2, we may be able to provide some money for remediation. And I provided a link to our application for the targeted brownfield assessment. And again, this is for nonprofits and municipalities. And what we can do is you fill out the form, we will take a look at it, make sure the site is eligible for a targeted brownfield assessment, and work with US EPA at the same time. Next slide, please. So as far as the phase 2s, the Illinois EPA has our own geoprobes. We actually have 2. This is one of them. This is our truck-mounted geoprobe. We also have a smaller track-mounted geoprobe. We can go out and collect soil samples, groundwater samples. We can install monitoring wells. We can collect soil gas samples. All of this can be done with our equipment, our staff. And then we also can identify, as we're doing our sampling, identify the geology at the site. So that's going to help as we go forward on the site and the project. Next slide, please. Some of the other tools that we have is an X-ray fluorescence. This is a machine that basically detects metals in the soil. And this is the picture here is shown as we can shoot it right at the soil on the surface. We can actually take and put soil in containers and analyze it that way. It's just a screening tool, but what it does give us is that it can tell us what concentrations or potential concentrations are there, and then we can actually take a soil sample there. So it kind of gives us a good screening tool to go around the site, especially if you have a site that is contaminated with metals. We can collect that data. We can go out and collect soil samples in some of the higher areas, which is great because it's a real quick and dirty way, especially when we have the drill rig out there to go out there and collect those samples. Next slide, please. We also have a metal detector. We've used this a number of times on some of our leaking underground storage tank sites where we're going out to try to determine if the underground storage tank is still in the ground. We're able to identify the tanks. We can identify any of the metal in the subsurface, utilities. We've identified drums in a couple of instances. This is linked to a GPS, so we have it identified. When we print out the maps, we know exactly where these anomalies are. In fact, a couple months ago, we just went out and helped the Office of State Fire Marshal determine at a site where they had some vapors in a nearby residential building, apartment building, that we went out there and assisted them use this machine and was able to determine that there were still underground storage tanks at the site, even though the site has long been developed into something different, not a gas station anymore. We were able to determine where the pump islands were and where the tanks were located. And we can provide the mapping, and I'll show you on the next slide, please. This is kind of the map that we can provide. The one on the right really identifies where the tanks, the possible tanks could be located, where the pump islands could be located, and where the fill pipes may have been located also. So this is additional information when we're going out to collect the soil and groundwater samples that we need to know exactly where to sample. Next slide, please. We are in the process right now of purchasing a ground penetrating radar that is going to help us in the long run on some of these other sites. As far as the targeted brownfield assessments, what those are no cost to the municipalities and the not-for-profits, because we analyze the samples through our Illinois EPA lab. We have a lab a few blocks away that we can analyze all the samples from. And if our lab cannot do those samples, we have a contract lab that is able to take those samples, analyze those samples for us. And then what is also nice about these target brownfield assessments is that we have a very experienced office site evaluation field staff. These are the guys and gals that are going out into the field that are collecting the samples, and we work closely with the targeted brownfield assessment applicants to identify what they're looking for from the investigation, and our staff will go out there and collect the samples, again, no cost to the municipality or the not-for-profit. Next slide, please. So actually, this is a perfect slide. I didn't know this was going to happen until a couple of days ago, but financial assistance from US EPA. So there's a number of grants from US EPA that municipalities and not-for-profits can apply for to assist in these brownfield sites. The first one is brownfield assessment grants. And a lot of this comes directly from US EPA's webpage. So you can request up to $500,000 to assess sites. We know that they've actually given more than $500,000 for these brownfield assessment grants. The revolving loan grants, you can apply up to $1 million to address brownfield sites. We don't see too many of these in Illinois for some reason. Some of the other states do have more of these grants. Probably the most we see in Illinois are these cleanup grants. And these are grants from $500,000 to up to $2 million. And this is to actually remediate the brownfield site. So you're going to go out and address that contamination, whatever you're going to do, dig it up, treat it, take it offsite for disposal. We see more of those than any of the other grants, it seems like, in Illinois. Multi-purpose grants. So these are to carry out assessments at sites and then also do some cleanup activities. We see some of these every once in a while, but those are also available for municipalities. And then job training grants. There are, I believe there was one last year in the Chicago area, a not-for-profit received a job training grant. It is used to recruit, train unemployed or underemployed people in the area affected by the brownfield sites. And why I said this is perfect is just yesterday, US EPA announced their grants, the sites that received grants throughout the nation, I believe it was. Illinois received 9 grants, totaling over $7.3 million. We had 1 multi-purpose grant. We had 6 cleanup grants, and we had 2 brownfield assessment grants. And this was for actually 8 communities and 1 regional planning council. So out of those 9 groups, $7.3 million went out to Illinois communities. Next slide, please. So what can we do for financial assistance? Again, I go back to the target brownfield assessments. We can do a no-cost investigation. We go out and do all the work. We prepare and provide a report to the municipality. They know what they have. We have a revolving loan fund, which we can issue up to $400,000, but we can go a little higher on those funding, but we can do that. And then cleanup grants. This is part of our grant from US EPA. We can assist with up to $250,000 in remediation costs. We can go higher if we have US EPA approval. We just have to work with that. And then the last thing is the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now's the time. If you're looking for grants, now's the time to do it. There's an influx of $50 million over the next 3 years now, that is almost double what we're used to getting. So now is the time, if you want to do this, to get in. And again, if you don't get a grant, Illinois EPA is here to help you out. Next slide, please. So I have 3 brownfield examples, and I'll try to go through those real quick. First one was a little over a half-acre site in Brookfield, famous Brookfield Zoo. This site was an old piece of property run by Lucas Tire, but there was a number of other activities there. It was taken over by the city. There was an underground storage tank, contaminated soil. What they were able to do there is to remove that underground storage tank, remove and excavated and disposed of offsite the contaminated soil, and turn that now into a Sherwin-Williams. So it is back into the tax rolls. A very nice Sherwin-Williams store there. Next slide, please. So the former U.S. Steel Works. This was a site that was entered into the voluntary program. It was almost 600 acres. What they did is they wanted to receive a no further remediation letter. So they received a no further remediation letter for residential use. So that allows any kind of use up to residential. So residential, industrial, commercial, whatever you want. Currently, it is developed into a park. There's a climbing wall. There's all sorts of trails, bikeways. But I think the bigger thing is they're looking at putting residential, light commercial, into this area. The biggest thing about this is their Urban Growers Collective has one of their bigger farms out in this area, and it is a 7-acre. They're able to have garden plots for nearby residents. This group is a very good group in the Chicago area. They provide food, training, mentoring, and land access for a lot of the communities in the south part of Chicago to allow them to have fresh produce. Next slide, please. And then I think the one I'm more familiar with is Green Era. They are taking over a 9-acre. It used to be a impound lot that the city of Chicago had. They went out there, did some cleanup. They're continuing to work out there. It's going to be an anaerobic digester. This is going to turn food scraps, and primarily they're looking at restaurants in the Chicago area. They believe they're going to be able to divert millions of pounds of food waste monthly into the anaerobic digester. And what it will turn into is basically compost and energy. And then they also have a farm here that for the community to come in, show them how to do things. They're going to be able to grow a number of varieties of produce on this piece of property. And they're going to be able to do it year round. They're going to have greenhouses out there. It's going to be a great project, and it should be finished here shortly. Next slide, please. So you can see, if you're looking for any of the reports, this is just a slide that you can actually get on our Document Explorer. If you're looking for a site, you can, if you want to see if there's any projects or any reports for that site, you can get on our website and take a look at that. So that's available to you. Next slide, please. And this is just contact. This is my contact. Mike, Charles, and Janessa are in our Brownfields program. And then Jerry is our Office of Site Evaluation. He heads up our field staff. And I believe that was my last slide.
Thank you so much, Greg. Our next presenters are Val Story and Brian Ross of the Great Plains Institute. Val and Brian, welcome. The floor is yours when you're ready.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. And thank you for having us and allowing us the opportunity to talk about our renewable energy siting work with communities in Illinois. Next slide. This is our contact info. I believe we'll be sharing slides if you would like to get in touch with us. Afterwards, our emails are on this slide. We're going to be talking about the renewable energy siting opportunities, particularly on degraded lands in Illinois. Both myself and Brian Ross are from the Great Plains Institute. Next slide, which is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis that works nationally, to decarbonize the energy system and to accelerate the transition to a net zero carbon economy in ways that benefits people, the economy, and the environment. Both Brian and I sit on the renewable energy programmatic area at GPI, or Great Plains Institute, though we work across various programmatic areas like carbon management, which works on carbon capture and storage and other carbon solutions. We also have a program area on wholesale markets and transmission infrastructure, in which I work as well. And we have a transportation and fuels division, etc. So that's a little bit about us. Next slide. Great. So we're going to begin with conclusions and next steps first, just so we don't miss it at the end. The first is an invitation to all of you to stay tuned. Later this summer, likely in July, both the Great Plains Institute and our partner, the Nature Conservancy, will be convening and hosting a workshop on opportunities to site renewables on low conflict lands, as well as on the tools at the state, local, and federal level that can facilitate the development of renewables on degraded lands in ways that both confer local tax benefits, jobs, and economic opportunities, especially for energy transition communities and frontline communities. So stay tuned for that announcement for a workshop in July. Next slide. I mentioned our partner, the Nature Conservancy. For the last year, the Great Plains Institute, along with TNC, with funding by the Crown Family Foundation, has been working to engage local and state stakeholders around mostly solar, but also around wind energy siting. And as you can see from the map on the left-hand side of your screen, the state and the region has vast utility scale solar potential. And in Illinois in particular, and with the passage of CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, there are policy requirements in place to achieve a 100% clean energy economy by 2050. And we're talking about a transition from approximately 21 terawatt hours per year to a 64 to 454 terawatt hour a year renewable energy production. And that range sort of depends on what happens with Illinois' nuclear fleet, as well as with the progress of electrification in the state. But it's this policy mandate, along with other policy mandates and initiatives such as the Renewable Portfolio Standard that Greg mentioned earlier, that are really driving this unprecedented interest and the deployment of solar and other clean energy resources in Illinois. And this growth has the opportunity to come with many local benefits, which communities can harness. And we believe that through proper planning, through proper site design, community engagement, that communities are well positioned to create win-win solutions that benefit the environment, natural resources, and the community itself. And not to mention that through this careful engagement and planning and site development, we can minimize land use conflicts. Next slide. And the reason we're here is one way to minimize land use conflicts, so reduce the amount of renewable, well, it remains to be seen how much we can reduce development on greenfields, but we believe that an important first step to potentially reducing the impact on greenfields or prime agricultural lands is to take every opportunity to develop renewables and drive that renewable energy deployment towards degraded lands. So these low conflict solar zones, brownfields, minelands, and other degraded lands. And through our community engagement work in Illinois with the Nature Conservancy, we've been working on building partnerships both to address land use conflict and the development and the appropriate siting standards around agricultural or greenfield development, as well as to identify and build partnerships for low impact solar development and identify communities that are sort of Brightfield ready, that have done work, perhaps put in local incentives to drive deployment and development towards these degraded land opportunities. And we're also working to identify opportunities for siting solar on degraded lands by exploring the kinds of financial incentives that local institutions and states can drive towards degraded lands. Next slide. I'm going to cover one more slide before I transition the slides over to Brian. So as I mentioned, we've been focused on working with communities to develop siting standards that are clear, that are transparent, and are consistent, and that maximize community benefits. Most recently, we've been engaged with communities in Illinois around the new state siting standard, which significantly changed local regulatory authority over siting and site design of renewable projects. So for example, the legislation requires counties to permit compliant commercial or utility scale solar facilities wherever agriculture is a permitted use. And it also restricts counties from directly or indirectly banning large scale renewable energy development. But what it does not do is it does not prohibit local jurisdictions from driving investments towards low conflict sites. And so the first step in this work that we see is helping counties and local government jurisdictions understand the degraded lands opportunity. And that's what we're going to focus on for the next few slides. I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Brian Ross, who's the VP of our renewable energy program. And he's going to share some information on the specific Illinois opportunities, some maps that have been developed by the Nature Conservancy, as well as some of the incentives available under the IRA to support the development of brownfields to Brightfields. Brian?
Mute. Unmute. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me now? All right, thank you,
can.
Val. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and the scale of the opportunity that there is for these for the focus on low impact or low conflict development in Illinois, as well as kind of some of the ties that we're seeing to certain other activities, particularly at the federal level, where there has been a heavy emphasis in trying to make sure that there is that the renewable energy transition, that the transformation that we're in now is going to have the effect of taking advantage of low conflict sites and redevelopment opportunities at the level. There's a heavy emphasis on in both CEJA in Illinois, as well as at the federal level, in ensuring that the communities benefit from the energy transformation that is now underway in this nation, and actually again globally. Go to the next slide. Next slide. This is just an example of kind of the scale of different kinds of opportunities that we see to do solar development on degraded or low conflict kind of development sites in Illinois. The Nature Conservancy ran and this is still a draft analysis, but they ran an analysis looking at all the different kinds of brownfields in Illinois, and then some analysis that identified ones that were particularly suitable for solar development and ones that perhaps were not, and then assessed where those sites were at and what was the total solar potential for those. And you can see here that this is a map showing the kind of a concentration of where those sites are. Now, of course, brownfields are located in pretty much every county in Illinois, but and we did kind of segregate the analysis between those places where the potential development was relatively low. And in this case, we kind of drew a threshold at 100 megawatts of solar development, which is still fairly substantial, but it is not at 100 is where you start to get into utility scale kind of development. And so you can see really that there are about 10 counties that have significant, which is greater than 100 megawatts of potential solar development on contaminated lands. And this is looking just at the brownfield portion of that analysis. The total amount of acres that TNC identified was about 8,400 acres, which is somewhere around a technical potential of 1,200 megawatts of solar, which is a great deal of solar by the current deployment standards, but it's only a small amount of the total deployment that we would like to see. Just as an example, to put this into comparison, right now, or fairly recently in Illinois, we ran an assessment of how many projects have been proposed, how many solar projects have been proposed. Illinois, the projects that are asking for interconnection to the transmission grid, and there was something like 41 gigawatts worth of solar, and you can see that the brownfield piece of that, if we were to compare it, is only about 1.2 gigawatts of solar. So it is a relatively small piece of the overall market, but it is a very critical one because it comes with particular local co-benefits about redeveloping sites that are otherwise unsuitable for development, as well as putting productive and economic uses on those sites so that they can be managed going into the future in a meaningful way. So this is the contaminated lands kind of assessment of potential in Illinois, and we hope to kind of have a public-facing draft of this maybe later this summer. TNC is working on that, so we can kind of get out and get some additional granularity about where these sites are at and what they look like. Okay, next slide. This is another category that's actually more significant, and that is the closed mine lands that are in Illinois. Again, we looked at kind of where there was opportunities for more than 100 megawatts worth of development in any given county, and identified 18 counties that have significantly greater solar opportunities on closed mine lands. This is the total amount of opportunity here. Roughly 160,000 acres of surface mines in the state are suitable for utility scale solar, and the technical capacity technical potential of that acreage is something like 20,000 megawatts or 20 gigawatts worth of solar capacity, which is where we're starting to see a significant amount of the market development and a significant amount of the overall long-term need that Illinois wants to get to in terms of the CEJA goals, decarbonization goals, can actually be done on these kinds of sites. So I just want to emphasize that the opportunity here is not token, but rather something that could be a significant piece of Illinois' overall energy portfolio if we took the time and effort to create partnerships around developing the opportunities and working to ensure that there are transparent and predictable pathways to development on these lands. Okay, go to the next slide. And kind of to talk a little bit about some of those opportunities, I wanted to note that the Illinois Power Authority, of course, through its various state statutes, and most recently CEJA, has developed a lot of incentives for which you'll hear more about in a few minutes. But I wanted to touch briefly on some of the federal incentives that have recently come into place, which actually work in kind of partnership with the local, any local incentives there might be, for which there is some opportunity, as Val noted, as well as the state incentives that IPA and other entities are promoting. The federal Brownfield incentives that I wanted to talk about, and there are a number of them, but I wanted to focus on one in particular, and that is that solar development has a 30% tax credit that's been in place for some time at the federal level. It's a significant incentive, and the recent Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, created some bonus tax credits that could be added to that 30% when certain conditions were met. And if you have the right scale of development and you have the right sequence of stackable benefits and stackable tax credits, you can get up to actually, and I don't think we'll see too many of these projects, but up to 70% tax credit for certain kinds of solar development, particularly when you're engaging low-income communities and making sure that the solar benefits are actually flowing to disadvantaged or low-income households. But what we wanted to talk about now at the community scale is what kind of benefits are there at the federal level for brownfield development. The federal tax bonuses are broken into three components. You can see there: domestic content, energy community, and low income. The most significant ones are in the low income category, but the energy community credit is a 10% adder to the investment tax credit or the production tax credit for solar development. If it meets one of the three criteria that you see below there that are bulleted, one of which is if your community has a brownfield site, it is considered an energy community eligible tax credit of 10%. This is something that we're going to be working with communities in Illinois on a forward going basis to help them identify where those geographic areas are that are eligible for this additional 10%, and to use that potentially as an incentive to drive development to those areas by working in partnership with solar developers, landowners, and environmental organizations. The other two categories that are important are where employment is primarily in the energy industry, and there is a high unemployment rate. And this is something that is applicable to a number of different communities in Illinois on a county basis. And then the third one is where there are census tracts that have a coal mine that was closed after 1999, or an coal-fired electric generating plant that was closed after 2009. And there are a number of counties that are eligible for this in Illinois, some of which we identified on the map on the earlier page, for which there is, again, an additional 10% tax credit. Now, the 10% tax credit by itself is probably not enough to overcome some of the liabilities associated with these sites in terms of added costs. But when you couple these things with, for instance, the IPA incentives, and potentially with other kinds of incentives that can actually be created at the local level, or that are focused on simply brownfield remediation rather than just the energy production, it can get, you can put together a portfolio that can actually make this an attractive place to do redevelopment. Okay, next slide. So the IRA is using the brownfield definition set by CERCLA, which is actually the same definition that was put up earlier, that Illinois also uses for the most part, or very similar to one, and it does include the areas that are consistent with the IPA standards: closed landfills, industrial sites, Superfund sites. Those are identified on the national priority list, of which I believe there's currently about 45 sites in Illinois that are on the NPL Superfund sites, and it does identify closed minelands as another place to that could be community potential energy community sites. Okay, next slide. And so, just to reiterate something that Val has already gone over, we wanted to close with our conclusions, as we opened with our conclusions, is that the Midwest Siding project that we're working on with Nature Conservancy is really looking for interested partners in building these Brightfield opportunities. And we will have this workshop that will be coming up in July. And this is going to be, we want to emphasize, somewhat of an interactive workshop. This is not going to be presentation of information one way, but rather we want to engage people in these workshops and perhaps hear from people like the people who are on this call. What are the opportunities or the barriers that you see to actually developing this opportunity? And this will include discussions with communities who are actually host to the sites that qualify for some of these incentives, and that are really sites that we want to target for redevelopment in order to create a host community benefit for the solar development as it moves forward in the state. And so a lot of the workshop is going to be about facilitating those community-focused partnerships and really identifying how we can get to that expanded Brightfield development and create local benefits and restore tax base. So with that, that's the end of our conclusion and our summary of our program and the things we want to do moving ahead. We do continue to work with the Illinois Power Authority on this, because obviously they're a key player in this field, as well as other stakeholders. So we really encourage you to contact us and express any interest that you might have in participating. And we're hoping to get solar developers, communities, environmental organizations, and other interested parties who want to see this thing move forward. So contact us. We'll have the meeting. We'll hopefully develop some partnerships, and we look forward to some great successes. So with that, I'll hand off the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you, Val. Our final presenter is Anthony Starr of the IPA. Anthony?
Great. Thank you, Brian. So I think that we've had a really interesting sort of setting the stage for resources that are available for understanding what brownfields are and some of the policy considerations and thinking about brownfield potentials for Illinois and the Midwest. And I think the sort of technical potential is really quite interesting. So what I'm going to try to do over the next few minutes is sort of pull this together to talk a little bit about how brownfield solar development is actually working within the context of the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard and the procurements and programs that we run. Next slide, please. So brownfield goals were established in the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was our major legislation, took effect back in 2017, that we set the stage for a lot of the work that's currently going on at the Illinois Power Agency to support the development of renewable energy in Illinois. It included in the sort of preamble text or sort of goals of the Illinois Power Agency, some sort of directional language in terms of why we are focusing on brownfield solar at the same time as through the Future Energy Jobs Act, we had a refocus of the Renewable Portfolio Standard, really to focus on the development of new renewable resources, both utility scale as well as smaller scale projects, but then also a real consideration for the opportunities around brownfield. The Future Energy Jobs Act also created a definition for what brownfield is, which I think, as you've heard a little bit, this sort of defining what is brownfield, what laws, regulations, programs, projects fit into is something that I think we've learned over the last few years. Seems straightforward at first. Once you actually start getting into the nitty gritty of what exactly is considered and what isn't, there are some gray areas to work through. And some of what we consider brownfield here in Illinois doesn't exactly line up with some of the federal definitions. I'll come back to that. Another thing that the Future Energy Jobs Act established was a procurement target for brownfields in terms of the overall goals of the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard. Next slide, please. So the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard is structured using a model of the sale of renewable energy credits from projects to our utilities to meet percentage-based goals that increase year over year. And those can come from either utility scale projects, small scale distributed generation projects, or community solar projects. Brownfields right now are fitting into the model that we use for utility scale projects. These are the very large wind or solar projects. But there's some key differences for how we look at brownfield compared to how we look at utility scale projects. First, utility scale wind or solar, which are categories within the Renewable Portfolio Standard, have a minimum size of 5 megawatts. So for solar projects using sort of typical 8 acres per megawatt, you're talking, that would be around a 40 acre site would be a utility scale project. But for brownfield projects, they do not have that minimum size requirement. So we have a policy that allows for us to have brownfields that fit into smaller sites. If you think back to some of the examples Greg was using in his presentation, often brownfield sites are a lot smaller because there are specific areas where pollution occurred. We also have a set standard for what is the eligibility for brownfields that's defined in our law in terms of what sites are eligible. We also have, unlike the utility scale wind and solar, where we have criteria that allow projects in states adjacent to Illinois to participate, brownfield site projects, the way it is defined in the law, would be located in Illinois to participate in the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard. And then shifting forward to the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which created some very exciting new labor and equity standards for renewable energy development in Illinois. Brownfield site projects do also need to conform to those same requirements. I also will touch on that in the adjustable block program, which is our program to support market rate distributed generation community solar, we do have some consideration of brownfield site locations for community solar project selection. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. If you want to dive a little deeper into how we do our utility scale and brownfield procurements, we have a previous power hour number 4 from last year, goes over that, as well as for those of you who like to read rather than listen or watch videos. Chapter 5 of our long-term renewable resources procurement plan lays out a lot of this in great detail. Next slide, please. So the brownfield target that we have in the RPS is sort of part of the sort of waterfall of overall standards. So we have normally when people think of renewable portfolio standards, they think about it as a percentage. For example, we're supposed to get to 30% of the generation in Illinois, 30% of the consumption of electricity by investor-owned utility customers in Illinois being covered by the RPS by 2030. But we also have in the RPS quantitative goals, where we have specific targets for how many renewable energy credits are to be procured and then delivered by 2030. And this slide shows sort of the breakdown of a portion of that coming from wind, a portion of it coming from solar, and then within solar, a carve out specifically for brownfield projects. That was increased through CJO. The Future Energy Jobs Act initially had a 2%, it was increased to 3%. And based upon sort of standard conversions of capacity factors, that is what would probably require about 280 megawatts of brownfield site projects to meet that 3% carve out. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges we have is around what exactly is a brownfield site. So Brian talked about CERCLA, but we also have several other categories within the Illinois law for what count as a brownfield site, whether or not it's part of the US EPA's corrective action program, several Illinois EPA programs, or that if it's on site of a coal mine that has permanently closed. So we in fact have a universe of brownfield definitions that goes beyond what would be eligible for the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. These requirements or sort of standards for what would be considered brownfield are sort of embedded within the enabling language of the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard. But in implementation, we've definitely had some challenges around how exactly we count what projects, what sites would qualify as a brownfield site and what wouldn't. So for example, what does regulated by a program means? How recently did that need to have happened is something that we've seen some challenges around. The Illinois Site Remediation Program is often used for clearing projects in real estate transactions. So regulated by that program has some meanings that I think may not completely square with the thought of what is a brownfield. So we've worked through these issues. I think we've come up with some pretty good ways to approach these. If you want to see the current requirements that we're using in our procurements, there's a link of that's on the slide. These slides will be available after the power hour. You can sort of see the exact ways in which we've taken these concepts and put them in sort of actual practice. Next slide. So where are we to date? This slide shows the locations of projects that have either that have participated in and been selected through the procurements that we've conducted. We had a procurement in 2019 that had 2 projects selected, both have been completed, representing about 30 megawatts of capacity. We ran 2 procurements last year, 5 projects were selected overall, another 33 megawatts. Those projects are under development. It can take many years for projects to get completed. There's lots of challenges around supply chains and others that make these have a fairly long development cycle. We also have a procurement process underway that I can't really speak too much about because it's an open procurement, but it's for both wind, solar, and brownfield site solar. The results of that procurement will be announced on June 29th. So check back with the IPA on our website on that date or afterwards, and you'll sort of see what additional progress we've made towards brownfield development in Illinois. Next slide. I also want to flag brownfield sites and traditional community solar. So traditional community solar is a category within the adjustable block program for selecting community solar projects. These are projects where they're medium-sized project up to 5 megawatts that then have subscribers who take a share of the output of them. We initially had a very open model for the application process for traditional community solar. And one of the changes that CJ made was to give the IPA sort of structure for creating a selection framework for picking traditional community solar projects. Including that, within that is consideration of a number of different categories. So we are scoring community solar projects based upon these 4 categories of built environment, the siting, the use of equity eligible contractors, connecting back the minimum equity standards that are part of the Illinois RPS, as well as interconnection agreement status. Within the consideration of built environment, we do have a consideration of projects located on brownfields, and they get additional points within that category. Looking at the scorings that we've released so far for this category, 14 out of the 276 projects submitted were eligible for brownfield site points. The final project selection for the traditional community solar is going to be taking place next week on May 30th. And at that point, we would have more information about how many of these community solar projects are that are selected in this round are on brownfield sites. I would also note that, interestingly, we have another solar program, the Illinois Solar for All program, that supports community solar and other projects for low-income households and communities. We actually have several community solar projects in that program that are actually located on landfills, even though that program does not have any sort of preference or set aside carve-outs for community solar projects that are on brownfields. Nonetheless, some of the developers in that program have chosen to do this. We have 2 projects, I believe, that have energized that on landfills in the Urbana area, and one that is still under development in the Waukegan area that are on landfills. So that's another way in which community solar and brownfields are sort of having an intersection here in Illinois. Next slide, please. So what's next? One is that while we're currently doing procurements for brownfield site solar through a competitive procurement model like we do the utility scale projects, there is a provision within the Illinois Power Agency Act that will allow us to consider alternative approaches if this model is not the one that is best suited for community solar. So this is something that we can be looking at in our next long-term plan that we're developing over this course of the summer, and we'll be taking stakeholder feedback on it. So this is an opportunity where if there's thoughts from stakeholders that there's other ways of thinking about how we incent brownfields, even with renewable energy credits ultimately being the currency we use for that incentive. If a competitive procurement structure is maybe not the best suited, we have an opportunity to rethink that. The other thing, I think this has come up already, is the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and the fact that there are now additional tax credits for brownfield. But our brownfield definition doesn't completely overlap the federal definition. So in that case, does that create some odd mismatches for projects in Illinois, some of which might get that extra 10% that Brian talked about, others that were not? I think that's something that still, as more guidance comes from the IRS, we maybe will want to look at how we're thinking about brownfields in that context. The final thing is potential legislative changes. There was some legislation, Senate Bill 1588, introduced this spring. It doesn't appear to have proceeded at this point, but it changed and updated some of the definitions of brownfield sites and also increased the procurement target. So there's clearly some interest from stakeholders on how to think about how to continue to refine through statutory changes brownfield solar procurement in Illinois. So I think there's a lot. We've achieved quite a bit on brownfields. There's still quite a lot to go here, but I think we have some really interesting opportunities, and I'm looking forward to people's questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. We've had a number of questions come in through the chat, and I see that Greg has answered several of those questions. We had one from Joe Scharf that regarding agrivoltaics put into practice and its possible use on brownfield solar sites. He asks whether animal grazing or vegetable growing would be considered safe on any of these sites eventually. I'm not sure if that's something that's determined on a case-by-case basis.
Sorry, yeah, I think that would be a case-by-case basis. We would have to figure out, if it'd be safe or not, but that's definitely something we could take a look at.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for your question, Joe. It looks like most of the other ones have been answered. So with limited time remaining, I'd like to, on behalf of the Illinois Power Agency, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. and we hope it was informative for you. Also, I want to extend thanks to our 4 presenters, experts, for preparing presentations and sharing their knowledge today. I want to take a second just to display the contact information of our presenters one more time, in case attendees have any additional questions and wish to get in touch. You can find a recording of this and other webinars on the IPA website under About Us/events. This one should be posted early next week. Thanks, and we hope you can join us for the next IPA Power Hour on June 30th. Have a great afternoon and a great holiday. See you next time.